Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Hope of Reconciliation in a Time of Conflict, Global Perspectives. My name is Joshua Snyder, and on behalf of the Church in the 21st Century here at Boston College, we welcome you to our panel discussion. I am an associate professor of the practice in theological ethics here at Boston College. My research focuses on peace building, transitional justice, and human rights, with a particular focus on Guatemala and Central America. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today for our webinar. We are honored to have such an esteemed panel offering global perspectives on social and political reconciliation. For those of you who don't know, I had the privilege of being the guest editor of C21 Resources 2025 magazine entitled Reconciliation, Healing Hearts. In that issue, the contributors explored multiple dimensions of reconciliation, from the intrapersonal to the sacramental to the social and ultimately to the political realms of reconciliation. And today's panel will focus predominantly on the hope and the potential of socio-political reconciliation, given that we live in such a conflictual time. Before we begin today, I invite us all to take a moment and let us join together in prayer. Good and gracious God, we bring our prayers to you today on this feast of St. Joseph the Worker. May we be inspired by St. Joseph, who worked tirelessly in support of the Holy Family. May we, too, be persistent in our work for peace, justice, and reconciliation, so that we might bring reconciliation to all members of our one human family. May we be peacemakers who sow the seeds of truth, mercy, justice, and forgiveness, so that one day we may all reap a harvest of reconciliation. We make this prayer through the intercession of St. Joseph the Worker, and in the name of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. So let me give you a brief overview of how our time together will be spent. I'm going to introduce our distinguished panel collectively. Then I will ask each of the participants an initial question, and they will have approximately 5 to 7 minutes to respond to it. Then there will be a second round of questions that build on their first round of insights. The panel will then have the opportunity to respond to one another and ask questions of each other. Then at the end, we will conclude by opening up the conversation to questions and answers from our members of the audience. As Andrew pointed out earlier, if you feel free to offer your comments in the chat anytime throughout, and we will bring those to our discussion at the end. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful panel. First, we have David Kwon, who is an associate professor of theology and religious studies at Seattle University. Dr. Kwon earned his PhD in theological ethics from Boston College. His research focuses on Christian ethics, just war, and just peace traditions, reconciliation, and post-conflict justice, with particular attention to global, East Asian, and post-communist contexts. Dr. Kwon is also an associate of the Catholic Institute for Nonviolence, contributing to their research on gospel nonviolence and the life of the church. He is the author of Justice After War, Jus Post Bellum in the 21st Century. Mr. Peter G. Martin serves as special assistant to the president at Boston College, where he advances strategic initiatives and key university projects. He chairs the steering committee of Boston College's Church in the 21st Century Center and teaches undergraduate courses on the Vatican's role in international affairs and U.S. foreign policy. Prior to joining Boston College, Mr. Martin was a U.S. diplomat for over 2 decades, including 7 years at the U.S. Embassy to the Holy See. In recognition of his service, Pope Benedict XVI made Mr. Martin a Knight Commander of the Pontifical Order of St. Gregory the Great in 2007. Father Marcel Uwineza is a Jesuit priest and the principal of Hekima University College in Nairobi, Kenya. He earned his PhD in Systematic Theology from Boston College. Father Uwineza is a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. His book, entitled Risen from the Ashes, Theology as Autobiography in Post-Genocide Rwanda, explores the themes of justice, forgiveness, mercy, and reconciliation in a world that is full of suffering. And last, but obviously not least, we have Dr. Ernesto Valiente, who is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology at the Clough School of Theology and Ministry here at Boston College. Dr. Valiente was born in Santa Ana, El Salvador. He earned his PhD from the University of Notre Dame. And Dr. Valiente's work focuses on Latin American liberation theology, the legacies and work of Gustavo Gutierrez and Archbishop Oscar Romero, as well as the preferential option for the poor and its implications for nonviolence. Dr. Valiente is the author of 2 books, The Grace of Medellin, Theology and Legacy, and Liberation Through Reconciliation, John Sobrino's Christological Spirituality. So let us begin our discussion. My first question would be for Father Marcel, who's joining us from Nairobi. I want to make sure that he is able to hear me. Father Marcel, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Beautiful, we can hear you. So Father Marcel, based on your work as a Jesuit and principal of Hekima University College, how do you see yourself building bridges and fostering reconciliation?
Thank you very much for Joshua for inviting me, and wonderful to be back, even though it is virtual, to Boston College, a place that formed me and made a big impact on my life. And so happy to see Valiente and others who have played a big part. And I was also invited to speak at Agape Latte of C21 by, I think, Karen. And so thank you very much. And now to your question, maybe first of all to begin by a definition of reconciliation, so that at least it gives a framework. This courageous process of healing broken relationships, of restoring trust, of confronting past wounds with truth, because without really going to the truth, or at least the maximum level of truth, there is no reconciliation, and creating a future where divided communities can begin to live together again. So just to put a framework on how I understand reconciliation. And this doesn't mean forgetting injustice or even forgetting the past. It is rather transforming the pain into, if you like, confronting a tragedy and transforming it into a drama. Transforming pain into new possibilities. So now as president of Hekima University College, how does this play out? To begin with, Hekima University College, first of all, is involved in education. And so education is a tool for healing and transformation. Here at Hekima, we believe that reconciliation begins in the mind and in the heart. Through quality higher education, we help students to move beyond divisions of ethnicity, of nationality, nationalism, of religion. And in our classrooms, young people from more than 30 countries of Africa and Asia, they learn together, they think together, critically discover that diversity is a gift, is not a threat. So in a sense, first of all, education here gives people the language, the skill of language, and the confidence to build wounded societies. And if I give concrete examples, we have students from South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Kenya, and Somalia, and many other places where we have experienced a lot of conflicts. And so having these students together in dialogue about conflict and justice and peace building and conflict resolution, I can't imagine any other better way of preparing future leaders. With people coming, students coming from these countries. So many come with painful histories shaped by war or division. And yet, as they study together, they realize that they have something in common. We have a shared humanity. Another example is also our training in ethics and leadership and conflict resolution. Students are equipped with practical skills in mediation and listening to and community service. Some of our graduates have ended up working at the African Union in peace and resolution of conflicts. Some of our graduates, especially in the Masters of Peace Studies and International Relations, have ended up working in the non-governmental organizations for reconciliation and peace building. So that's one way Hekima contributes. Another way is also empowering, the way we empower women. And this is my privileged place, empowering women from war-torn nations to become peace builders. We have made it a preferential option to offer scholarships for women. Currently, I'm in my third year now as president of Hekima, but we now have 24 women from Somalia, from Liberia, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from Rwanda, and you name it, who receive scholarships to study with us. Many come from places marked by violence, as you can imagine, marked by displacement, by refugee camps, and yet they have risen from the ashes of conflict. As we accompany them, this is not simply to earn a degree, but to become peace builders, peace practitioners, ethical leaders, and agents of reconciliation. And we have an African proverb that says, if you educate a woman, you educate the whole village. So that has become a privileged moment for me. And I want to give a credit to one of my professors at Boston College. After I finished my graduation, my doctoral defense, Professor Copeland put me aside, Sean Copeland put me aside and said, Marcel, I know your heart is back in Africa. And indeed it is. And then she said, please don't forget the formation of women. So in these 3 years, I have fulfilled that request from my director of the dissertation. The last point on this is how we save refugees in save students in refugee camp, especially the Kakuma camp. We offer some certificate courses and even courses in leadership and peace leadership. I give you an example. I went for graduation in September last year in this refugee camp, and the valedictorian spoke so heartily, and he said, Hekima University College has turned our refugee camp, Kakuma means nowhere. Then he said, you have turned a place named nowhere to a place of somewhere. Now I have a certificate, I have a degree. When I leave the camp, I can make it in life. So if you ask me, that's one way we participate, besides my own publications, of course, in the area. Back to you, Joshua. I hope I've responded to your question.
You responded wonderfully. Thank you so much, Father Marcel. Thank you for your beautiful insights in terms of educating for peace and nonviolence, the importance of empowering women, and how truth is essential for the promotion of reconciliation. Now I turn to Mr. Peter G. Martin. Peter, you've worked for many years as a U.S. diplomat. What do you see as the role of reconciliation in terms of diplomacy? How do you see these ideas as being connected?
Thank you, Josh. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're perfect.
Great. It's tough act to follow Father Marcel on the road in the dark and giving such an eloquent response, but I'll do my best. I do want to thank you, Josh, and also it's an honor to be with these other panelists who are such great scholars and have such great experience in the field. And I also noticed that we have some in the audience too with great experience. Saw Sister Marianne Lochry, I think. So I think it's a great group. Hopefully we can have some good exchange later. I would say, and I should say thanks to the C21 Center too, and to the staff who does such great work on all this, these types of programs. So I would say for diplomacy, speaking of diplomacy and the connection between diplomacy and reconciliation, I mean, there are many different definitions of diplomacy. Certainly, one of the most important elements of diplomacy is that one is promoting the foreign policy priorities of the country one is representing, if you're speaking in that sort of a framework, which such as the one I worked in. But I think in order to do that effectively, even if your first priority is promoting those priorities, you have to be able to listen well. You have to be able to understand the point of view of your interlocutor, your diplomatic partner. You have to really be able to put yourself in that person's shoes. And it seems to me, again, that's another definition of an approach to reconciliation, I think, that type of communication. I would also add, as an aside, perhaps, that in the context of diplomacy between nation states, that a nonpartisan professional diplomatic corps, I think, is in the best position to do this effectively. So I think, again, communication is a huge part of this reconciliation element of diplomacy. And when I think about communication, I think about a time early in my diplomatic career in which that a lesson of how important communication was brought home to me. And this is not an earth-shattering revelation, but I think it was because it was the first time that I had experienced it personally. I was an election monitor in Kosovo. It was probably 2001, 2002. And probably most of you know that the Balkans had experienced terrible violence, and the Kosovar Albanians in particular had been on the receiving end of some terrible violence, and there have been, of course, problems on both sides. But the Serbs were from their point of view, their great enemy. And we were there trying to monitor on behalf of an international organization to see that there might be free and fair elections. And in my group of election monitors, there was someone from the Polish government, and I had served in Poland previously, and we were out and about, and I was speaking to him in Polish when all of a sudden one of the other people from our group, one of the organizers, rushed up to us and said, "Don't speak Polish." She said, "You've got to stop speaking Polish," because Polish as a Slavic language sounded a lot like Serbian, and there had been some instance of violence when the Kosovar Albanians had heard what they thought was Serbian or even something related, and there have been some pretty bad situations that came about. And so again, this is not a novel concept, but it really brought home to me, having been the first time I experienced it, that the divide between these peoples was so great that even hearing something that sounded like the opposing group's language was so traumatic. I would say another example I would like to raise that I hope illustrates this close connection between diplomacy and reconciliation is the example of the community of Sant'Egidio. And this is a group I know Josh knows well. This group is based in Rome. It's a Catholic lay organization, and they're very heavily involved in interreligious dialogue and conflict resolution, really all over the world. But Francophone Africa, they're quite active. Some other places as well. Their biggest early success was brokering a peace to the Mozambique Civil War in 1992. But they'll be the first to tell you the small team that works on their international relations efforts, they're not professional diplomats. They'll be the first to tell you that. They're international relations experts for sure, but they have some advantages as non-state actors that helps them to really move forward on reconciliation efforts. So, for example, they undertake long-term relationships in the countries where they're active. They're not moving from place to place like diplomats who are assigned to an embassy for a couple of years. They're not moving out of office like political leaders. They're in, they would say, for the long haul, and they get to know different leaders, different groups for years and years at a time in different countries. And having these deeper relationships then puts them in a position where they can understand the groups, excuse me, and engage when there's a need to at whatever point. I would say also that their ability as a non-state actor not to have other interests that might impede their relationships with these groups is important. So they're not trying to get any trade agreements. They're not trying to take any territory they would say that their primary or their only real interest is peace. And I think that helps them to get closer to the groups and to help them engage in dialogue when necessary. And I would say the last element that really helps them engage in the reconciliation, pure reconciliation, really, is that as a non-state actor, they're not. They can engage with groups that state actors may not be able to. So, for example, there may be some rebel groups or certain groups that have blood on their hands. The Holy See, the United States, other countries can't really sit down at the table with those groups because it might legitimize them in certain ways, might give them certain recognition. Whereas Sant'Egidio, a little bit under the radar, can meet with them, can try and bring them along, help them meet with an opposing group. Later on, if there's an agreement, if there's progress, then maybe the state actors can come in and help legitimize these things in a different way, at a different level. But yeah, so I think Sant'Egidio in that way is a great example of mingling this diplomacy and reconciliation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter, for your great insights, for the highlighting the importance of listening well, being able to understand alternative perspectives, the value of communication, as well as the power of non-state actors in promoting reconciliation and being an essential part of diplomacy and building peace. I now invite Dr. Ernesto Valiente. Neto, thank you so much for joining us. And my question for you is, as a Latin American liberation theologian, you have noted that there is a bit of an aversion to the concept of reconciliation from a liberationist perspective. Can you discuss why this might be the case and how we might be able to consider reconciliation in relationship to justice?
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you for your invitation. It is really a pleasure to be here. I shouldn't do this, but I also noticed that the Sisters of Mount Carmel are in our audience, and I want to send a shout out to them because they are good friends, and I love that they are present with us. So let me get to your question. The first thing that I like to say is that the issue of that liberation theologians have with reconciliation is not with reconciliation itself. Okay? Gustavo Gutierrez, John Sobrino, both, they all understand that the purpose of liberation is indeed reconciliation. Liberation is in fact a journey towards communion. So that's the first thing that I want to set aside. The second thing that is important to notice is that most reconciling efforts, most peace building efforts, usually stress the reality of healing after a community, after a war, after a civil war, after the conflict has taken place. Liberation theologians, on the other hand, are seeking the reconciliation of a society or a community while this society is living under conditions of oppression, under conditions of conflict. Okay, so those two nuances to begin. Now, I would say that there are two reasons, and you're right, there are two reasons why liberation theologians tend to be a little uneasy about the term reconciliation. The first one has to do with the reception of liberation theology in Latin America, and also especially with the reception of liberation theology among the ecclesial authorities in Latin America. Okay, because liberation theology stresses the importance of justice. There were a number of bishops like Cardinal Alfonso López Trujillo, that were concerned that liberation theology called to confront sin, to confront oppression, and to call for some type of social transformation may lead to conflict and violence. So that's their concern. And we don't want to caricature that. It's a real concern. The problem, though, is that they propose, and Cardinal Trujillo did this explicitly, propose a theology of reconciliation as an alternative to liberation theology. Okay, a theology of reconciliation that in many occasions did not incorporate addressing issues of justice. And this, in a way, concealed the reality of millions of victims suffering the oppression of unjust social structures. Okay, so that's one of the issues. Also, sometimes the way that these theologies of reconciliation are presented, they tend to call for a blanket forgiveness. Okay, because we are Christians, they would say we are all sinners, so we need to forgive. And in principle, that's correct. We are all sinners. But this argument presumes something like a moral symmetry between the sinfulness of the perpetrators, of military dictators, and the sins of the victims. So it didn't address the responsibility of these agents, but the idea was basically to continue to maintain and in a way justify the society as it was. That's the first issue, one of reception. The second one, and the most important, I would say, is the second one. More important has been how this idea of reconciliation has been manipulated by those in power to protect the perpetrators. For example, I am from El Salvador, as you know. In El Salvador, we had a truth commission who presented an excellent report that outlined who were the guilty of the human rights offenses. 85% of those were from the military, from the government, 5% were from the guerrillas. Okay? But what is very interesting is that 5 days after that report was published, the National Assembly passed an amnesty for everybody, after 12 years, after 12 years of civil war. These amnesties were very common last century in Latin America. We have amnesties in Chile, in Brazil, in Honduras, Argentina, Guatemala, Peru. So reconciliation then lost that dimension of justice, that dimension of reparation, and became this term that meant let's forget what happened and let's begin again. Those two um, are the main important things. But let me say just a couple of words about what is the process of reconciliation for liberation theology. For liberation theology, there are three key moments in the process of reconciliation. First, there has to be a moment, as Father Marcel so well said before, there has to be a moment of a truthful uncovering of the events and the sources of the conflict. Okay? This truth should lead us to pursue justice and the reparation of the damage that has been done. So this pursuit of justice is supposed to respond to the claims of the victims. This pursuit of justice is the second moment. And here I wanna make a point. I would say that such justice is always necessary, but often not enough for reconciliation. Because there are things that cannot be repaired or restored, like human life, for example, and also because justice without mercy often leads to cruelty. An example of this we saw, for example, in the events in Rwanda, where the victims became avenging victimizers. So that's why liberation theology, with its Christian emphasis, is going to stress how forgiveness is, even though this forgiveness cannot be forced upon anybody, but is necessary to restore communal life and to begin to construct a new future. So these three aspects, truth, justice, and forgiveness, then is the way I think liberation theologians understand reconciliation. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Beautifully, Neto. Thank you so much. And thank you for those wonderful insights about the threefold process of reconciliation, coming truthfully to account for the past, the pursuit of justice, and the promotion of forgiveness. Now I invite Dr. David Kwon. David, it's a pleasure to have you with us. And for you, I have a question based on your most recent book on justice after war. So, David, what do you see as the relationship between reconciliation and the broader Jus Post Bellum tradition? And what hope is there for political reconciliation in a post-war context?
Thanks, Josh, and thanks to C21. And it's a real privilege to be part of this conversation along with Father Marcel and Peter G. Martin and Ernesto Valiente. So they all share great kinds of the conversation, start with a great conversation here. Let me highlight 3 points in framing the relationship between reconciliation and Jus Post Bellum, namely justice after war or post-war justice. First, I think it's important to clarify what we mean by reconciliation in a social and political sense. Reconciliation is often understood in interpersonal or moral terms, restoring relationship, forgiveness, and healing. Those are important. And from a moral and theological perspective, they reflect a deep vision of restored communion. And I think Ernesto Valiente also mentioned this clearly too. But at the social and political level, reconciliation involves something more demanding. And it requires a reconstruction of shared political life, not just sharing governance, but where former enemies or former adversary or former rivalry groups can coexist under conditions of security, legitimacy, and participation. In that sense, reconciliation is not simply about repairing relationship. It is about rebuilding the structure that makes those relationships possible. Second, this is where Jus Post Bellum, again, the post-war justice and peace building, becomes essential, where my work tries to make a more specific contribution, I believe. In my book, Justice After War, I argue that reconciliation cannot bear the full weight of post-war justice on its own. Instead, the foundation must be what I describe in my book as human security, the protection of socially vulnerable population, and those, including those who are oppressed, as Ernest Valiente also mentioned, and especially those, the protection of vulnerable population in the immediate aftermath of war, alongside the longer and more sustainable term pursuit of political reconciliation. So in many post-war contexts, the most urgent reality is not reconciliation, but survival. And I see this as a reality and as a protection from ongoing violence, instability, and deprivation. So to make this more concrete, in my book, I identify 3 foundational practices that structure post-war justice: the reconstruction of just policing, just punishment, and just political participation. So first, there must be legitimate forms of security, what I describe as just policing, where civilians are protected and basic order is restored without domination. Without this, reconciliation has no stable foundation, while reconciliation, some people call thin reconciliation, opposed to thick or fuller version of reconciliation. Second, there must be accountability, what I describe as a just punishment, not as vengeance, but as a way of establishing responsibility for harm and restoring the rule of law. Without accountability, reconciliation risk becomes superficial or even unjust. I think Father Marcel and Ernesto and also share a good example regarding this. And third, there must be inclusive political participation so that those affected by conflict are able to shape the political order going forward. Without participation, whether state actors or non-state actors, and I think Peter Martin also shared these things, and reconciliation remain imposed rather than shared. So taking all this together, these three, just policing, punishment, and political participation, are not alternative to reconciliation. They are the conditions that make reconciliation socially and politically possible, but also meaningful. So my central claim is this: reconciliation is not the starting point, but it is the outcome of these prior conditions, institutional conditions. So we see the importance and the essence of this condition in many contemporary conflicts. And in places like Ukraine, for example, even discussions of reconciliation remain secondary to questions of security and survival. And in Gaza and Israel, cycles of violence persist in part because issues of accountability or legitimacy and political inclusion remain deeply contested. And historically, we can see that where these conditions are uneven, and whether in post-conflict societies like Iraq or Afghanistan, effort at reconciliation often remain fragile and even reversible. And there are still a lot of conflicts. And so this case reminds us that reconciliation cannot be sustained apart from the structure that support it. As I argue recent my OPED, one of the most overlooked truths about war is that ending violence is not the same as building peace. So if peace is postponed until after war ends, the conditions that produce conflict often remain intact. Likewise, we can understand reconciliation issues from this regard. And from as also moral theologian, from also theological and philosophical perspective, we might say that reconciliation without justice risk becoming what Lutheran pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer would call cheap grace, something offered without the condition that make it truthful and sustainable. And drawing on Catholic thinkers like Bernard Lonergan, reconciliation ultimately depends on legitimacy, on whether political authority remains accountable to the community it serves and open to truth and dialogue. And perhaps finally, my more recent work, I've been increasingly attentive to the limits of frameworks that begins with war, namely just war tradition, even when they are oriented towards justice after it. Use post-bellum within the just war tradition, but I see some limit from that contribution, that tradition. The concern is that when our ethical framework begins with war as a given, they risk becoming reactive rather than proactive, and focus on managing the aftermath rather than transforming the condition that produce conflict in the first place. I think the word transformation is Father Marcel, Ernesto, and Peter, they all share today, and it's important. And this is why I've been exploring whether just peace and non-violent offer a more appropriate horizon, one that does not simply respond to war, but seeks to reshape the moral and political imagination sustains it. So I would frame the relationship this way. My final word, and reconciliation is not the starting point again, but it is the outcome of sustained social and political reconstruction. And ultimately, the hope for reconciliation depends on whether we are willing to build those conditions, social, political, and moral, that makes it possible. Thank you. Yeah.
Beautiful, David. Thank you so much for all of your thoughtful insights, particularly possibly shifting our lens from moving from just war tradition to a just peace tradition. And I really value your insight about highlighting the primacy of human security in a post-conflict situation through just policing, just punishment, and just participation. We're going to move on to our second round of questions. Father Marcel, if you're able to hear us, hopefully, I know you're on the road and hopefully you can hear me.
Yes,
And
I can hear you.
beautiful. So, Father Marcel, given your own work in peace building, your own experiences in Rwanda, and your obviously immense experience in education, what do you see as hope and opportunity for reconciliation within East African countries?
Thank you very much, Josh, for the question, and really to appreciate the inputs of the previous panelists and the wonderful ideas that have come up. I learned quite a lot. And maybe in addition to what I said earlier, we have a program of diplomacy and security and peace studies which respond to this academically. Now, what are the opportunities, the moments of hope and opportunities, if you like? And I'm glad that we are beginning with what is positive. It's good to count on the youthful population of Africa. The average age here on this continent is 22, 23. That may vary from one country to the next, but generally, we are a very young continent, age-wise. And that's an opportunity. Young people are creative, they are connected, they are energetic. They are not just problems to solve. They are actually opportunities for growth and for the future. And many of them have been increasingly interested in areas of justice. Here in Kenya, you may have heard of the Gen Zs and how they have been able to challenge some of the legal systems and even up to the presidency to change some of the laws of that were not favorable to the population, especially the high taxing. So if young people are formed well, they can become the generation that breaks the cycle of violence. And that you can see that across. If I were to go to Rwanda, many young people now born after the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, they have never experienced this, the atrocities that some of us have gone through. And so even when you have a conversation with them, they acknowledge the past, but then they say, but we have to live we have our own future to live. So let's not be nailed to the past. Be informed by the past, but also not be determined by the past. So the youthful population of Africa, for opportunities, for entrepreneurship, I think the challenge is that there is often lack of political will to use this energy. The second, the women as leaders of peace. Across the continent, women are leading mediation, education, trauma healing, even at grassroots. I take an example from my country. We had the traditional courts called Gacaca. Gacaca were grassroots judicial courts that were used to try a number of the perpetrators of the genocide because prisons were full. And so the country engineered a legal system that would help to bring people and hear them together and to get to know the truth. And among the most prominent legal advisors or legal practitioners in the gacaca were the women, and were women of integrity. At the same time, women who have become lawyers have been able to forge laws that go against domestic violence, that have promoted women to have their own bank accounts. Believe me, even up to now, there are some places where women wouldn't have a bank account. So now some laws have come because women have stepped up, at least in Rwanda. And even inheritance for girls. And so those are opportunities. And I mentioned the women in scholarship here at Hekima who are studying peace. And we just managed to get some other scholarships for students who will come from the refugee camp. And then let's talk of the opportunities that arise because of interfaith dialogue. I am pleased to mention one of our centers of interfaith that brings different practitioners of different religions to come together. Because yes, Africa has a lot of Christians, but also we have many Muslims. So to live together, we need to learn how to dialogue and to appreciate one another. So churches, mosques, and traditional leaders often they become trusted places of reconciliation. And when faith leaders collaborate through institutions, they can achieve a lot. And then finally, education and refugee empowerment. Initiatives like what I mentioned of educating the poor, preferential option for the poor, especially with the Jesuit Refugee Service, a Jesuit organization that helps many people in the displaced place.
It looks like we might have lost Father Marcel on that last note, but hopefully he'll be able to get back to us. But just to recap, I think Father Marcel highlights four wonderful opportunities for hope: the youth, women as leaders of peace, the value of interfaith and interreligious dialogue. If Neto, you'd be willing to join us.
Here I am.
Excellent, excellent. And as the audience will notice, the questions are getting more geared towards specific context. So for you, Neto, given the rising tensions, aggressive rhetoric, and U.S. involvement in Venezuela, what do you see as perhaps challenges as well as opportunities for reconciliation between the United States and other Latin American countries?
Thank you for your question, Joshua. This is a very pertinent question. I remind you that I answered this question not as an American citizen, but as a foreigner in the United States. So with a degree of delicacy. I think the best way to frame that issue of the intervention of the United States in Venezuela is to frame this question within the framework, with a historical framework, within the context of the Monroe Doctrine, that argues that basically the Latin American nations fall under the sphere of influence of the United States. Rooted in this assumption, okay, in this political assumption, the United States has intervened in Latin America, depends upon how you measure that, but the intervention, direct and indirect intervention, between 12 and 20 times. Okay. Granada, El Salvador, Chile, Panama, Dominican Republic. We can continue that. So the main challenge, I think, right now in the relationships between United States and Latin America is one of deep distrust. These interventions have created two things: tremendous distrust, tremendous suspicions, and also have created, in many cases, much instability in the region. Let me give you an example to put some flesh on what I'm talking about. As I was telling you before, I'm from El Salvador. In El Salvador, United States supported a dictatorship through a civil war, a 12-year civil war. At the same time, it supported civil dictatorships in Nicaragua, in Guatemala. These situation of injustice generates a tremendous instability on what is called now the North Triangle. Well, this then situation of the instability, what leads to is a great amount of refugees, people who cannot longer stay in their home because of their violence. So then you have this migration coming to the United States, and the United States then turns around, looks at Latin America, and says, how come are you here? Well, we are here because of the type of foreign policy that United States has maintained in Latin America. Now, so let's talk about opportunities to address this instability and to address this suspicion. I think it seems to me, and I'm not a political scientist, so please feel free to correct me at any moment, but we have a task to move from coercion to negotiation. We need to begin to create relationships that are really mutually beneficial, that lead to development, but within a context of respect and solidarity. United States has always been also an ambivalent force because it can create a lot of good, and it has created a lot of good. Okay, and something else, we have to make a distinction between the policies of the United States as a nation and the American people. The American people have always been tremendously solidarious with Latin America. You always see them working in communities, especially faith communities. So it's important to make that clear distinction between the people and some of the policies that a government might decide. Now, what are then our opportunities? I would say we're going to talk about two opportunities. One first is the Latino people. Do you know that 20% of the United States citizens have Latin American roots? So this 20% of an American population represents a structural bridge that can help for the harmonious relationship between the people of the United States and the people of Latin America. They also exercise a political influence, okay? But not only a political influence, they also exercise a cultural influence in the sense that they represent the people from Latin America and are witness to the fact of our common humanity, of our common interest, of the realization that people in Latin America and people in the United States, we are basically one. So I think the first opportunity is on the people. The second opportunity, I see it in those trans, transcultural organizations, institutions that are able to transcend geographical boundaries. Okay, these transcultural organizations offer us an imagination that is more universal, an imagination that honors the value of the human being. And we can talk about, organizations like the United Nations, but perhaps I would like to focus better on those transcultural organizations that are rooted in faith-based communities, because faith-based communities uphold the sense of the rights of the human being, stress values of solidarity, stress the need for a common good. And here, I think faith-based communities like Christian, Catholic communities have been always very important to create bridges that are able to transcend geographical limitations. So I leave you with those two. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Netta. I appreciate it. Peter, on to a little bit of Vatican diplomacy, perhaps. So, as a diplomat who has worked with the Vatican, what role can Vatican diplomacy play in fostering social and political reconciliation? And are there any insights that we can learn from the recent exchange between Pope Leo and President Trump?
Putting me on the hot seat with that one.
I know. Thank you.
No, I think, I had a great experience working with the Vatican Diplomatic Corps. It's the oldest diplomatic corps in the world. And I think that it follows from what we've been talking about in terms of dialogue and reconciliation. The Holy See, I think, is often very effective at avoiding taking political viewpoints, instead speaking out for broader principles of human dignity. And I think this is helpful because it leaves them as more of an unbiased voice for these rights, rather than typically being able to be buttonholed into one political viewpoint. Now, this, of course, if you're on the receiving end of, in your mind, of some of these broad pronouncements about human dignity, you might feel that it's political. But I think that it's the wrong way to look at things when you're watching the Holy See. Now, I think some people can get frustrated because it is a subtle diplomacy often that the Holy See undertakes. I sometimes talk to my students about an instance in which I really learned about that early on in my career when I was at the Vatican. There was a particular dictator who was coming to the Vatican, and we were concerned that he was going to use a visit to the Vatican as good public relations for himself, to get a nice photo op with the Pope, and really leave in better standing than he came in. And I went and spoke to my counterpart in the Vatican, Foreign Affairs equivalent, and raised our U.S. concerns about that. And he said, no, we understand. I mean, we're always going to be open to dialogue with everyone, but we know that this guy is not a great actor, and we'll do some subtle things to make sure that's noted. But the visit came and went, and it looked to us that it went pretty well for him. He got a nice photo op. Our colleagues back in his capital reported he had pretty good media reaction. And when I called back my Vatican counterpart and said, hey, we thought you all were gonna, not let him have it, but certainly make it known that he wasn't the most well-regarded leader to visit the Vatican. And he said, well, we did things subtly. We in the notice about the visit, we said that the visit and the audience with the Pope was at his request. He also said that they put the notice on page 2 of the Osservatore Romano, which is the Vatican newspaper, to show that it was not held in quite the same regard as other visits. And he also mentioned, he said, well, and didn't you notice that we passed a white paper to this leader? He said that white paper had some of the concerns of the Holy See on it. And I said to him, well, but that wasn't noted in the media, or no one knew that there were concerns. It was just basically a paper that was noted that was passed. It could have been anything. And he said, yeah, but that's the way we do things. And it was really a great learning experience for me. And I should have warned the State Department that, in order for the Holy See to remain open to dialogue and to leave themselves in a position where they can hopefully bring people along, even little by little, they don't name and shame, as some people say. And just briefly, so that was, I think, a good example of that subtle diplomacy. Turning to President Trump and the Pope, I think it's important to look at what Pope Leo's been saying. Again, not as political statements, but he's voicing these broad principles. He's speaking out for peace. He's speaking out for the human dignity of migrants and immigrants. And I think that it's a mistake to look at it any other way. Now, of course, there are always political ramifications of these things, but I think it's a mistake to look at the Pope as much of a political actor as I think some of our leaders have started to do. And I would say that it's a great example of, again, a Vatican diplomacy, the response of Pope Leo, very measured response. He said, I'm not afraid of the Trump administration, but I have to speak out. And he tried to tamp down the conflict somewhat by saying some of my speeches in his recent trip to various African countries, these were written 2 weeks before. These are broad principles that I'm always going to talk about. So I think that's a good example. And one last quick thing I'll say is that another example of this, maybe some of the people who have been listening are aware of a media kerfluffle about the papal nuncio who was, they said he was called in to the Pentagon for a meeting. And the reports about this meeting were that Pentagon officials were dressing down the Holy See, excuse me, and basically telling them they better get on board with Trump foreign policy because we're moving ahead. The papal nuncio, when this came out, said, no, this was a normal diplomatic meeting. He said, nothing to see here. And I'm sure that there was a little more to it than that, but that's his job, to keep things calm, pave the way for dialogue. It's not going to help anyone to have a lot of controversy about this. And so that was the approach he took. And I think that the new papal nuncio, Archbishop Cacho, who spoke at Boston College, excuse me, in the fall, will take that same approach. We've got a U.S. ambassador to the Holy See I've heard good things about, who is I'm sure going to try and do the same things. So I think there's great potential for continued dialogue and work from the Holy See on these issues.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you for your great insights on subtle diplomacy and the fact that speaking out and being on the side of peace is a nonpartisan issue. I think that's something we really need to hold to in these days. David, if I could call you back, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on what you see as both hopes and possibilities for reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula, as well as major challenges and obstacles to that.
Thank you. Let me approach the Korean context, Korean Peninsula context, by highlighting 3 challenges and then a brief note on the possibility. First, the Korean context presents a fundamental structural challenge. The war has never formally ended. So this means that it's a ceasefire. So this means that unlike a ceasefire for more than 70 years, so this means that unlike many post-conflict societies, there is no clear transition from war to post-war reconstruction. Instead, we have a prolonged condition of unresolved conflict and what we might call suspended post-war, and which is a term actually introduced by Bruce Cummings, University of Chicago historian and Asian studies scholars. So, so back to from the perspective of youth postbellum and post-war justice, and this creates this kind of the suspended post-war situation creates a significant limitation because the framework assumes at least a minimal transition into a post-war phase where reconstruction can begin. So that's the one thing I want to say. And the second, this has direct implication for what I described earlier as human security in light of my book discussion. So in the Korean Peninsula, security remains militarized and fragile. While large-scale violence is absent, the underlying conditions, military tensions, nuclear escalation, as you can see, keep seeing the news media, and the geopolitical rivalry, and are surrounded by all great powers, US and Russia and China and Japan, and frequent local kinds of encounters over the last 70 centuries, that those things continue to shape everyday political life. So this means that foundational condition for reconciliation, which are supposed to help stable and secure social life, remains incomplete even now. And third, the question of political reconciliation remains deeply contested. And there is no shared political framework between North and South Korea that could sustain reconciliation in a meaningful way. Instead, reconciliation effort often depends on shifting political leadership, diplomatic openings, in accordance with the interest, again, of great powers, which makes them difficult to sustain over time. As a result, in the case of Korean context, reconciliation remains more aspirational than structurally grounded. So we can see this in concrete ways. An inter-Korean initiative, which has been implemented into Korean Peninsula for the last 70 years, such as family reunions and economic cooperation project. Good example is a Kaesong Industrial Complex, and which was eventually bombed by Kim Jong-un, but often emerging during periods of political openness. But they are, again, fragile and can quickly be reversed. And similarly, broader diplomatic efforts are shaped not only by Korean state actors, but by, again, global powers, and which further complicates the possibility of a stable and internally driven process of reconciliation. So historically, the legacy of the Korean War, Cold War division, and competing political systems has produced deeply divergent and narratives, a lot of meta-narratives about justice, legitimacy, and national identity. These differences are not easily reconciled because they are embedded in political institutions and collective memory and trauma. And from a theological perspective, and this reflects the difficulty of sustaining reconciliation where justice and trust and shared political life remain incomplete, whether through the state actors or non-state actors, including church. So reconciliation in this sense and cannot be simply reduced to goodwill. It depends on whether the condition for just and durable peace are actually present. And this is where my more recent work becomes relevant. The Korean case highlights the limits of framework that begins with war. Again, just use post-bellum solely or primarily limited within the Joshua tradition. So because even decades after active conflict has ceased, the structure of conflict remain in place. This suggests that, again, a more appropriate and effective and sustainable approach may require shifting toward a just peace and non-violence framework, one that focuses not only managing conflict, but on transforming the political and social condition that sustain it over time. At the same time, these are important resource of possibility, which I address in my book and my articles through Journal of Catholic Social Thought. Civil society actors that includes both state actors and non-state actors that Peter G. Martin also shared about here. But so civil society actors and religious communities, Ernesto Valiente also mentioned about the church, the Lord of the Church, and grassroots initiative. All these continue to create a space for dialogue and memory and engagement. These efforts do not resolve structural conflict on their own, but they contribute to the longer-term conditions that make reconciliation more plausible, feasible, and meaningful. So in the Korean case, my final word, and reconciliation is not absent, but remains limited because the institutional and political conditions necessary to sustain it not yet fully in place. And ultimately, the hope for reconciliation depends on whether those conditions can be built over time. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And we've gotten a few questions in the chat. So if I could just pose two to all of the presenters, and feel free if anyone would like to jump in. One of the questions was regarding what is the role of the preferential option for the poor within reconciliation? And this was directed both to Neto as well as Father Marcel. And then for Peter and David, both of you mentioned truth or communication, but how do you foster truth for reconciliation in sort of a post-truth world where it seems that the truth becomes very ambiguous? So if anyone would like to jump in, we've got about 3 minutes left.
I can take the one of the preferential option for the poor and try to make it very concise. In a process of reconciliation, nobody can take the agency, the lead that the victims have in social process. The victims are the ones who have endured the consequences of the damages, the oppression. They are also the only ones that can offer some type of forgiveness. They, they give us the direction in which the process should lead. So they are the victims, those who have suffered, the poor, are the ones that most, their voices, their perspective must be incorporated and take a leading role in the process of reconciliation. That's a quick answer.
Beautiful. Peter, would you like to shoot at truth in a post-truth world? How do you promote truth within diplomacy and reconciliation?
Yeah, I think you've hit on one of the big challenges. I think it's very difficult. And I think of dealing with the Ukraine crisis. There were a lot of people who thought that Pope Francis should have spoken out more sternly against President Putin, both after the 2014 annexation of Crimea and later. But at Vatican City, the Russian diplomatic representation, they were constantly promoting misinformation, and they were coming to the Holy See and saying, no, these aren't Russian affiliated troops in eastern Ukraine, many other things as well. And it makes it very difficult for an entity like the Holy See or any entity really that's trying to be even-handed in looking at a conflict to know what is true and what's not, even though what we did was we brought a lot of experts from Washington. We brought our ambassador from Kyiv to come to the Vatican and say, hey, this is what's happening on the ground. I'm sorry, but you can't trust what the Russians are saying.
Excellent. And with that, my friends, unfortunately, our time has come to an end. I wish we had more time for the Q&A, but at least we got 2 of the questions posed. I know I speak on behalf of our audience when I thank all of our panelists, Father Marcel, Neto, David, and Peter, for your thought-provoking comments today and your wonderful insights. It was a wonderful conversation. And for everyone, I hope you continue to stay involved in the conversations being offered through the Church in the 21st Century here at Boston College. So thank you all for joining us today.